Imagine standing on the Malecón in Havana tonight. The waves are crashing against the seawall, but behind you, the city is pitch black. There are no streetlights. The hotels are running on diesel generators that are sputtering and dying. The food in the refrigerators of 2 million people is rotting because the electricity has been off for 18 hours. Turn on the news today, January 5th. You see headlines about a humanitarian crisis. You see politicians in Miami talking about the end of the dictatorship. We are taught in school that this is the inevitable failure of communism. We are told that the Cuban government is incompetent, corrupt, and finally collapsing under the weight of its own inefficiency. But that is a fairy tale. If you strip away the political rhetoric and look at the forensic accounting, you don't see a failed state. You see a distressed asset in the final stages of a hostile takeover. What is happening in Cuba right now is not a revolution. It is a liquidation event. The United States is not trying to liberate Cuba. It is enforcing a lien. For 60 years, the U.S. Treasury has held a mortgage on this island, and the interest has been compounding every single day. The blackouts, the hunger, and the exodus of the workforce are not accidents. They are the calculated results of a financial siege designed to lower the acquisition price of the real estate. We are watching the foreclosure of a nation. And the price tag for the new owners to move in is exactly $50 billion. To understand this bankruptcy, you have to ignore the CIA and look at the DOJ, the Department of Justice. The weapon that is killing Cuba is not a gun. It is a piece of legislation passed in 1996 called the Helms-Burton Act, specifically Title III. For 20 years, every U.S. president suspended Title III because they knew it was an act of economic warfare so extreme it would break international law. But in 2019, the suspension was lifted. This activated a poison pill in the Cuban economy. Title III allows U.S. citizens to sue anyone in the world who traffics in property confiscated during the 1959 revolution. But it defines trafficking as merely using or profiting from the property. Do you know what that means legally? It means that if a Spanish hotel chain manages a resort in Varadero that sits on land once owned by a Cuban exile, they can be sued in a Florida court for hundreds of millions of dollars. If a cruise ship docks at a port in Havana that was nationalized in 1960, that cruise line owes the original owners the value of the port, plus interest, times 3. This effectively placed a lien on the entire island. It meant that no foreign investor, not China, not Russia, not Europe, could touch Cuba without risking a lawsuit in the United States. It turned Cuba into a toxic asset. It cut off the capital flow not with a blockade of ships, but with a blockade of lawyers. Where does the $50 billion figure come from? It is the sum of the debt trap. The U.S. Foreign Claims Settlement Commission certified 5,913 claims worth $1.9 billion in 1960. Add 6% interest per year for 66 years. That number swells to roughly $9 billion. But Title III allows for treble damages, triple the value. That takes us to $27 billion. Then add the uncertified claims from Cuban Americans who were not U.S. citizens in 1960 but are now allowed to sue. The total liability hanging over the island, the exit fee that any new government must pay to enter the global financial system, is conservatively estimated at $50 billion. The island's GDP is a fraction of that. Cuba is structurally insolvent. It is owned by its creditors. The second pincer of this strategy is the State Sponsor of Terrorism, SSOT designation. In the last days of his administration in 2021, Donald Trump put Cuba back on this list. The Biden administration kept them there. The media calls this politics. The Ledger calls it de-risking. Being on the SSOT list doesn't just mean you can't buy weapons. It means you are radioactive to the global banking system. No international bank, not even in Europe or Asia, will process a transaction for Cuba because they are terrified of U.S. fines. This created a liquidity crisis. Cuba has money, they export nickel, they export doctors, they sell cigars. But they cannot move the money. They cannot buy oil on the international market because they cannot find a bank to wire the payment to the tanker captain. This is why the lights are out in Havana. It's not that they don't have oil, it's that they don't have a SWIFT code. The U.S. effectively froze their checking account, forcing them to use cash and barter in a digital world. Look at the news from October 2024 to today. The collapse of the National Electric System, SEN. The Antonio Guterres power plant failed. The entire island went dark. The government blamed maintenance. But why was there no maintenance? Because they couldn't buy spare parts. Why? Because the spare parts contain U.S. patents, or the companies that sell them trade in dollars. The U.S. strategy was to degrade the infrastructure until it physically broke. A blackout is a powerful weapon. It destroys the food supply, no refrigeration. It destroys the water supply, no pumps. It destroys the will to resist. When you see Cubans protesting in the streets, banging pots and pans, they are not shouting for Jeffersonian democracy. They are shouting for light. They are shouting for food. The U.S. turned the energy grid into a torture device. The message to the Cuban population is simple. The lights will come back on when the government changes. Tourism was the only lifeline Cuba had left. It brought in hard currency, but the U.S. strangled that too. First, they banned cruise ships. The Title III lawsuits scared them off. Then they eliminated the ESTA visa waiver for Europeans. If a European citizen visits Cuba, they lose their right to enter the U.S. visa-free. Think about that. You're a French tourist. You want to go to the Caribbean. You can go to Dominican Republic and still visit New York next month. Or you can go to Cuba and be banned from visiting the U.S. for life unless you get a visa interview that takes 2 years. Who goes to Cuba? Nobody. Tourism collapsed by 50% compared to pre-pandemic levels. The hotels are empty. The cash cow was slaughtered. The proof of this strategy is found in a courtroom in Miami. Look at the case of Havana Docks Corporation versus Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and Norwegian. Havana Docks Corp. is a U.S. company that owned a pier in Havana in 1960. The pier was nationalized. For decades, cruise lines docked there, paying the Cuban government millions in fees. In 2022, a U.S. federal judge ruled that these cruise lines were trafficking in stolen property. The judgment? Over $400 million in damages. This ruling was a signal to the world. It said, if you touch any asset in Cuba, a port, an airport, a hotel, a mine, we will bankrupt you in U.S. court. It effectively privatized the embargo. The U.S. government doesn't need to patrol the waters around Cuba anymore. The lawyers for the plaintiffs are doing it for them. This is the brilliance of the $50 billion trap. It ensures that China and Russia cannot save Cuba. China likes to buy infrastructure. They like to buy ports. But China is not going to buy the Port of Mariel if a U.S. judge has already ruled that the port belongs to a family in Miami. If a Chinese company buys that port, their assets in the U.S. become vulnerable to seizure. The poison pill ensures that Cuba cannot be bailed out by the East. It is legally shackled to the West. The debt must be paid to the U.S. claimants before anyone else can invest. We are witnessing a slow-motion asset forfeiture. The U.S. courts have begun to issue default judgments against the Cuban government. Cuba doesn't defend itself in these courts because they don't recognize the jurisdiction, so they lose by default. These judgments are accumulating. $2 billion here, $4 billion there. Currently, there isn't much Cuban money to seize abroad. But the moment the regime falls, or the moment they try to reintegrate into the global economy, those judgments will be waiting. Every barrel of oil Cuba tries to export, every shipment of nickel will be subject to seizure by creditors. The country has been pre-foreclosed upon. Now, look at the near future. The blackout lasts for a week. The water pumps fail. Disease starts to spread. The narrative shifts from sanctions to humanitarian aid. The U.S. will offer to send emergency power barges to Havana to turn the lights back on. They will offer food shipments, but the condition will be the acceptance of a transition council. This is not an invasion, it is a receivership. The transition council will not be run by politicians. It will be run by technocrats approved by the IMF and the U.S. Treasury. This is where the $50 billion comes back. The new government will be broke. They cannot pay the $50 billion in claims. So the creditors will offer a deal, debt for equity. You can't pay us the $400 million for the port? Fine, give us the port. You can't pay us the $100 million for the hotel? Fine, give us the hotel. You can't pay the judgment for the land? Give us the land. It will be the greatest privatization sale in the history of the Caribbean. The entire island, its beaches, its mines, its airports, will be transferred to holding companies to settle the Title III lawsuits. The Cuban people will be told they are now free, and they will be free. Free to work as maids and bellhops in hotels that are owned by the grandchildren of the people who owned them in 1958. The tragedy of Cuba is not that the revolution failed. It is that the counter-revolution was financed with compound interest. The U.S. proved that you don't need to invade an island to conquer it. You just need to control the banking system, wait 60 years, and let the lawyers do the rest. The $50 billion lien is the chain that binds the island. The revolution died not when Fidel Castro died, but when the first Title III lawsuit was won in a Miami court. The lights will come back on in Havana soon, but the electricity bill will be paid directly to Wall Street. I'm James, and this is The Hidden Balance. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw the foreclosure coming. Don't forget to subscribe. Join those who see what others ignore.